So hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Happy New Year to all of our new attendees and returning for our first talk of the year. I'm Bailey Mizell, the director of PAC LA, and we're here today with Arpad Kovacs. Sorry, Arpad, I practiced that a lot, and of course. And Arpad will be giving a lecture presentation today on American photographer Peter Hujar. He'll be walking us through Peter's first exhibition of his work, exhibited here in Los Angeles, currently at Mark Selwyn, closing tomorrow. And then he'll also give a survey of Hujar's career, juxtaposed with some imagery from Hujar's closest influencers and friends. I added a link in the chat to the exhibition page with Mark Selwyn. Thank you, Mark, for letting us give this talk today. And Arpad, thank you for being here with us. Do you want to say hi?
Thanks for having me.
I just want to give a quick shout out. I'm gonna give the bio and run of show, and then Arpad will take it away. But I want to give a quick shout out to our board of directors at PAC LA and our membership base for your ongoing support and commitment to PAC's growth. Helping us to be what we are today and for future events like this that are forthcoming. So thank you for your support. So a little bit about today. Arpad's gonna give a presentation for about 45 to 50 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A following that. I'll go ahead and go off screen once Arpad's presenting and come back at the end to moderate the Q&A. So please feel free to add your comments and questions in the chat or the Q&A at the bottom. And I'll be checking that as the presentation's happening. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and give you a little background on Arpad, and then Arpad, you can take it from there. Arpad Kovacs is an assistant curator in the Department of Photographs at the J. Paul Getty Museum. His exhibitions have focused on 20th century and contemporary photography with a specific interest in conceptual practices and time-based media. A graduate of Queen's University and York University, Arpad arrived at the Getty Museum in 2011. He organized the monographic exhibitions Hiroshi Sugimoto, Past Tense in 2014, Werner Herzog, Hearsay of the Soul, 2014, Richard Leroy in the Studio, 2016, and a number of thematic shows as well. I'll be able to put a link in the chat for Arpad's full bio. And again, I will be off screen for the presentation, but I'll return at the end for the Q&A. And please feel free to add your questions and comments there throughout the presentation. And again, thank you, Arpad, for being here with us. And I'm gonna let you take it.
Great, thank you so much, Billy. I'm gonna share my screen and I hope this works.
Looks good.
Looks good? Excellent. Yeah. Glad this is working. It took a team effort to figure this out. So I would like to thank, first of all, Margie Ornston, Michael Hawley, and Paula Ely from PAC LA for inviting me to share my thoughts and enthusiasm on the work of Peter Hujar. I'm by no means an expert on his work, but I've been an admirer for a long time. I also want to thank Bailey at PAC LA for organizing the logistics so wonderfully. And also, of course, for Mark Selwyn and Andy Brown and Mark Selwyn Fine Arts for their support. I had a chance to see the show, which Bailey mentioned closes tomorrow, I believe, at the end of December. And it's beautifully installed. And Mark mentioned that this is the first solo exhibition of Hujar's work in Los Angeles. And so I wanted to take this opportunity really to give an overview of his life and his work, but also to intersperse images by other photographers and artists whose work I think resonates with the subjects that Hujar photographed. I will not be addressing all of the photographs included in the show, and I'll be jumping around a little bit in his chronology. Of course, I'd much rather do this in the gallery with all of you for several reasons. One being that Hujar, there are a number of vintage prints included in the exhibition, and Hujar was a very fastidious photographer, printer rather, and really put a lot of emphasis on his darkroom practice. But the new prints in the show, which were printed by Gary Schneider, a close associate of Peter Hujar, are simply stunning. And so I hope those of you who have the opportunity, who live in Los Angeles and have some time tomorrow, can get a chance to head over to Mark Selwyn's gallery and see it. I don't know exactly when I first encountered the photographs of Peter Hujar. It must have been in the early 2000s, and most likely it was through a book at the library during my undergraduate studies. The literature about his work was far from abundant. What I do remember is being in awe of his portraits. Even if I didn't know who the sitters were, and often I didn't. Attention to his work has thankfully continued to flourish, and there are many more books and articles available now than there were 15 to 20 years ago. For the content of this presentation, I'm sort of deeply indebted to Joel Smith's catalog that accompanied the show Peter Hujar, Speed of Life, that was on view at the Morgan Library and Museum a few years ago, which traveled to the Fundación Mapfre and Madrid, and also to the Jeu de Paume in Paris. The catalog is densely packed with a great deal of information and detail about Peter's life and his work. So who was Peter Hujar? In a 2000 review of Hujar's first posthumous survey, organized by New York's Matthew Marks Gallery, titled Peter Hujar, Photographs 1980 to 1987, the critic Vicky Goldberg described the photographer as possessing a sensibility both emotionally removed and tender, respectful of the compromised dignity of the least of his acquaintances, a trifle solemn, alert to signs of death and ruin, and constantly mindful of the delicate sorrows of the human condition. I think these words quite beautifully encapsulate Hujar's photographic sensibilities, and they do appear on paper. They also echo the tenderness and patience that some of his sitters remember as being part of Hujar's temperament while making photographs. But to those, at least to some of those who knew him personally and were part of his intimate circle of friends, they often have far less kinder words to describe his character. The writer Fran Lebowitz, in an interview, said that he was one of the most difficult people in the world. Stephen Koch, another writer, a friend, and who later became the executor of his estate, said that he was an angry and difficult man. Hujar, apparently, was notoriously stubborn, cantankerous, and quarrelsome. According to Joel Smith's essay in the catalog for Speed of Life, Hujar kept his childhood in obscurity through both silence and misdirection. In one account he often used, he had been born in Hollywood to a Busby Berkeley chorus girl. If pressed, he might admit that he was born in New Jersey and raised on a farm. Even close friends heard only bits of the fuller story that produced this sort of tribal sense of identification. He was part of the sort of outcasts of the world. His father, Joseph John Hujar, disappeared from Peter's life shortly after he was born, and shortly before he was born, and the two never met. His mother, Rose Kuleba, a waitress, lived and worked in Lower Manhattan. The youngest of three siblings, Rose placed Peter with her immigrant parents in Ewan Township in New Jersey. The Kuleba spoke Ukrainian at home and halting English outside. Rose visited periodically, but Peter later said he began speaking English only as a remedial student in the local school. After finishing high school in 1953, he worked for some 15 years as an assistant to commercial photographers, various commercial photographers, often earning the use of their studios and darkroom after hours. He traveled to Italy twice during this period, first in 1958 and again in 1962 with the aid of scholarships, including a Fulbright, which he used to live in Rome and study filmmaking. One of several breakthroughs in Hujar's career was his acceptance into a masterclass taught by the photographer Richard Avedon and famed art director Marvin Israel in 1967. For the class, he submitted a series of nude running self-portraits he shot after hours in the Harold Krieger studio, a business that catered chiefly to the advertising industry. In each photograph, he is seen in full length, frozen in frenetic motion by a strobe light and positioned far from the camera, leaving a cavernous empty space that is activated by his body. Sort of as an aside, these pictures, which I think came to light relatively recently. Certainly he didn't, I don't think, exhibit these in the few exhibitions that were organized during his lifetime. But these pictures remind me of Bruce Naumann's video experimentation in his studio from around the same period, in which Naumann taped a square to the floor of his studio and walked around that square. Though it's unlikely that Hujar would have been familiar with Naumann's work. Hujar was a longtime admirer of Avedon's work, and over the following years, roughly between 1968 and 1972, he tried to make it as a freelancer in the mass market world of fashion, music, and advertising photography. He would fill assignments for Harper's Bazaar and GQ with lesser paying jobs. In one of his assignments for Harper's Bazaar in 1962, he photographed model Charlene Dash in a variety of outfits in real world settings. But the constant need to hustle for work and competition with others for assignments was not a good fit for him. And in 1973, he moved into the loft above the old Eden Theater at 12th Street and 2nd Avenue, which became the setting for his mature studio work. In the 1970s, the crumbling infrastructure around the East Village, with its increasingly crime-ridden and arson-prone atmosphere, was a place where artists could live without thinking much about money. It was a real sort of haven for a lot of artists and creatives, as I think they're called today. Hujar saved his attention for a downtown-centered culture of dance, movement, art, film, drag performance, and music. During this period, Hujar would regularly contribute to Newspaper, an oversized all-pictorial tabloid published between 1969 and 1971. That was a pet project of art director and sometimes boyfriend Steve Lawrence. Newspaper is hard to describe. It was a grab bag of pictures from everywhere, including images sourced from science fiction B-movies, South American ethnography, photojournalism, gay and straight pornography, among other types of genres of images. Its overall aim was to collapse distinctions and assert continuity, notably between high and low. Newspaper is sort of a drop in the flood of Warholian projects of this time that celebrated photography's knack for getting into and taking over everything. The final issue of Newspaper, which the image on the screen is actually one of the first issues, it is the first issue rather, but the final issue in 1971 is notable for being different from its predecessors in focusing on a single topic, the Coquettes. The Coquettes were a drag ensemble from San Francisco who came to New York for a series of performances of the revue titled Tinsel Tarts in a Hot Coma. Hujar was asked, along with others, to photograph the Coquettes during preparations for the show. The hype around them cast a spotlight on an aesthetic of clashing gender cues: slack deportment, vintage gowns, and long beards full of glitter that would come to be known as gender fuck. It had nothing to do with men passing for women or critiquing glamour, but about crossing signals to achieve a wild mess. Hujar took an avid interest in their coarse-grained style as it aligned with his appreciation for the art of drag. In 1972, the filmmaker John Waters released the film Pink Flamingos, starring the drag performer Divine, soon to be a friend and subject of Hujar. Divine, growing up in a conservative household in Baltimore, took an early interest in drag while working as a woman's hairdresser. He starred in several of Waters' films beginning in 1968, and in the 1970s moved to theater, appearing in several avant-garde performances alongside the Coquettes. Hujar photographed Divine both in and out of makeup. But the picture that's included in the show at Mark Selwyn is especially a favorite of mine. Here we see sort of a tender and disarming portrait. Disarming, I use that word very strategically, given that one of the other images that I'm showing from John Waters' film Pink Flamingos, he's of course holding a gun. But this view of Divine, Hujar's view of Divine, is one that audiences who perhaps only knew him through Waters' films would rarely see. Hujar, much like D.N. Arbus before him and Nan Goldin afterwards, photographed trans individuals, drag performers, and others who challenged accepted norms. Like Arbus, he photographed in black and white, primarily, with the subject usually alone and centered in the frame. Unlike Arbus, he did not think his sitters any more peculiar than the rest of the world, and made no efforts to make them seem so. He represented their dilemma, which was in effect the human condition. I think there are a lot of similarities between the work of Hujar and Nan Goldin. And in fact, there was an exhibition at Matthew Mark's gallery, I believe, several years ago that looked at the work of Peter Hujar, Nan Goldin, and D.N. Arbus, which I thought was sort of a really interesting juxtaposition of these three artists' works. But the connection between Hujar and Goldin is especially sort of fascinating to me. Their works often come from the same place and focus on the same types of people operating on the fringes of mainstream society. Unlike Goldin, Hujar rarely worked in color and never as a snap shooter, but slowly and contemplatively, as if every picture were sort of a meditation. He did not chronicle the lurching progress of the days or the knots and tangles of relationships in much the same way that Goldin's operatic ballad of sexual dependency lays bare. Ethel Eichelberger, a key player on the East Village scene of the 1980s, became a friend and a regular subject. Best remembered today for his high-octane solo drag performances for nearly 20 years, Ethel wrote, produced, and staged and starred in a series of 32 madcap and highly idiosyncratic plays based upon the lives of great women in history, literature, and myth. The plays, including Nefertiti and Medea, concern strong women who were survivors, mix high and low elements with accordion-accompanied songs, fire-eating, and rigorous acrobatics. They were performed to critical acclaim by Eichelberger with razor-sharp acting skills in clubs and performance spaces such as the Pyramid. And I have here a poster for one of his performances at the Pyramid. And what I love about the two pictures of Eichelberger in the show at Mark Selwyn is that they really do provide this sort of interesting juxtaposition, one really delving into the performer's interiority and the other purely about surface. In addition to his ability to capture sort of the inner workings of big personalities, Hujar made photographs of his surroundings, landscapes, cityscapes, and views detailing his living situations with great regularity throughout his life. These two pictures of rippling and uneven surfaces of water, one made in Italy and the other um, reinforcing the dark and mysterious reputation of the Hudson River, suggests a sort of constantly wandering eye that sees aesthetic potential in what others may seem deemed to be too banal. Architecture to Peter was fascinating, but his understanding, or at least his photographic approach, I think differed significantly from prominent photographers who made skyscrapers and the evolving skyline of New York City their bread and butter. Hujar often conflated his photographs of buildings with portraits. And in 1977, he had an exhibition that was staged by his dealer at the time, Marcus Pfeiffer, titled New York Portraits. He chose to photograph towers in Midtown and portrayed them, for the most part, from a vantage point on the sidewalk or from a low rooftop, thus filling the frame with sky and crown. And I love this. When I saw this photograph, it immediately made me think of Berenice Abbott's views of New York, shot from the street. New York in the 1970s and 80s could be a challenging place for both residents and visitors alike. By 1970, the city gained notoriety for high rates of crime and other social disorders. In February of 1975, New York City entered a serious fiscal crisis. Under Mayor Abraham Beame, the city had run out of money to pay for normal operating expenses and faced the prospect of defaulting on its obligations and declaring bankruptcy. Visitors were advised not to venture out of Midtown Manhattan, not to take the subway, and not to walk outside anywhere after 6 in the evening. The city was compelling in its contradictions, a vibrant and often cheap place to live. It attracted young talented people in droves, but it was also coming apart at the seams. As Philip Gefter notes in his essay for the Morgan Library's catalog, in the early 1970s, the rise of the gay rights movement occurred simultaneously with the growing stature of photography in the art world. It was nothing more than a coincidence, but homosexuality and photography surfaced, respectively, from the margins of mainstream society and artistic legacy. In 1969, a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, a bar in Greenwich Village, incited the bar's patrons, along with local residents, to protest in the streets. Historians refer to the demonstrations as the Stonewall Uprising, marking the symbolic beginning of the gay rights movement in America. And Peter photographed this this march, or one of the marches, rather, I should say, which then became the poster for the Gay Liberation Front. During the 1970s, a number of artists became particularly interested in Manhattan's West Side piers that stretched along the Hudson River between Chelsea and Greenwich Village, including Peter, as you can see by these two photographs. This area was popular for sunbathers during the summer months, and it became a site of infamy for the congregation of outcasts and misfits, including prostitutes, drag queens, artists, runaways, and gay men nonchalantly cruising for anonymous sex. Another photographer working at this time, Alvin Baltrop, made hundreds of pictures at the piers that simultaneously convey the liberating atmosphere of a place unrestrained by traditional mores, and documented the gritty realities of this period in the city's history. He befriended many of the site's frequent visitors and made portraits with an emphatic eye that was rare in the tradition of street photography. His intimate, often unabashedly voyeuristic photographs reflect a brief moment of sexual freedom for gay New Yorkers in the aftermath of the Stonewall riots and before the HIV/AIDS epidemic ravaged queer communities across the globe. The place also drew artists. Joan Jonas organized experimental performances, and perhaps most famously, Gordon Maddock Clark staged Day's End, a site-specific work for which he cut an opening into the abandoned industrial shed on top of Pier 52 to expose its interior to the sunlight. And you can see this cutting in two of the pictures on the screen. The West Side piers were also the site of collaborative projects by a host of conceptual and performance artists that were documented in detail by the photography duo Harry Schunk and Janos Kende. A growing trend in Hujar's photography in the mid-1970s was a concentration on the nude. The nude as a pictorial genre uses a range of formal conventions in pursuit of relatively specific and limited ends. Hujar's photographs of unclothed sitters in whole and detail point to other aims, more in keeping with portraits in a portraitist's interest in the singularity and interiority of his subjects. Philip Gefter wrote the following about Hujar's portraits of Gary Schneider, which I think is a thoroughly sort of considered studio photograph. The two were close friends, and the picture was made over the course of a casual afternoon session. Schneider, today an accomplished artist, was proficient in gymnastics. Sitting naked on the floor in front of Hujar's camera, he began to contort his body as they talked, joked, and laughed in a session he remembers as collaborative, performative, and playful. Schneider recalls Hujar was gentle in encouraging his subject to give him something to work with, as opposed to imposing a specific direction on him. "I'm not easy to be photographed," he says, "but Peter waited until my defenses were dropped and I became comfortable. And then there was a very strong communication between us." In Gary Schneider and Contortion, Schneider was striking a pose that he and Peter both considered a parody or perhaps an homage to Edward Weston's Pepper photograph. Hujar's nude photographs have been associated more often with sex than with concerns of portraiture, however. And sex clearly figures into many of them, more than incidentally. But in them, sex is also integrated with the rest of the life of the body. Sex often brought him to the nude, but as a starting point. Hujar's sex life, busy before Stonewall, had grown busier after, more entwined with his photography. He had greater opportunities in the 1970s to photograph sexual partners. Conversely, it had become easier in the new era to use sex to generate the intimate conditions he was after in a portrait. And now I want to kind of shift a little bit and talk about two artists who were quite central to Peter's life, both personal life, but also his development as a photographer. In 1956, Hujar met the painter Joseph Raphael, whose friend, the artist Paul Teck, suffered from pneumonia and hepatitis and had been instructed to move to a warm climate and relocated from New York to Florida. In the winter, Hujar and Raphael drove down to Coral Gables, where they met up with Teck, and the three photographed one another in a ruined boathouse on the James Deering estate. By the end of 1959, Teck and Hujar, now a couple, were living back in New York. Teck traveled to Italy in 1962 while Hujar was on his Fulbright, and together they visited the catacombs in Palermo, an experience which had a strong influence on both of their works, but especially that of Teck. It was during this time that he began to work with installation and sculptural objects, most notably creating wax sculptures made in the likeness of dissected parts of the human body. His art became equally memorable for his rejection of popular art trends. For example, he hated minimalism, which was really sort of in vogue at the time, and mocked its pristine geometries with these meat pieces, hairy, bloody flesh cakes fashioned after cross sections of animal tissue, and housed in metal-edged glass cases. They were really sort of at odds with the sort of messy pulp within them. By the early 1960s, tech was growing ever more connected in the downtown art scene and was closely associated with a number of artists and writers, including Eva Hesse, Jean Swenson, and Susan Sontag. Tech was particularly close to Sontag, who in fact dedicated her 1966 collection of essays against interpretation to him. Sontag would go on to write the introduction to Hujar's first photo book, titled, published a decade later. Hujar's portraits of his accomplished friends, lovers, and acquaintances draw on some balance between, I think, Richard Avedon's sort of existential minimalism and Diane Arbus's psychological complexity. And I apologize for the poor quality of this image, but this is an image of Hujar's first book, Portraits in Life and Death, with a cover image from the catacombs that he photographed in Italy. This was published in December of 1976, and it opens with a picture of John Waters. Two of the performers that he would eventually photograph most, Ethel Eichelberger and John Hayes, are not present, nor, curiously, is his hospital portrait of Candy Darling, made several years earlier. The book's title presents life and death as neighboring states. In the winter of 1980 to 1981, Hujar met David Wojnarowicz. A creature of the city, David was 26, one-time abused child and teen hustler. He was an unknown, struggling poet, street artist, and member of a scrappy band, 3 Teen Kills 4. Their relationship, briefly sexual, soon shifted to orbit around David's manifest talent and Hujar's commitment, much like a protective father, to keep David making art and succeeding with it. His prolific output included wall paintings at abandoned Pier 34, called the Art Pier, where Hujar photographed often and extensively. They had met at an ideal moment as their art meshed. Hujar in his work had been turning more and more towards the subject of the city as he knew it, a place of abandoned structures, nighttime cruising, and early morning vistas. His photographs, like David's graffiti, had become part of the village cityscape. By 1985, Wojnarowicz had risen to enjoy a degree of influence in the East Village gallery world, and he lobbied for what would be Hujar's first solo show in New York since 1981. And also his last. Peter Hujar recent photographs appeared at Gracie Mansion Gallery in January of 1986. This photograph of Greer Langton in a fashion pose is one that I think draws on Hujar's early sort of interest and experience with fashion photography or with commercial photography. Greer Langton was born Greg in 1958 in Flint, Michigan, and transitioned at a young age and moved to New York to realize her dream of becoming an artist. Langton's own self-transformation, adoration of queer icons like Candy Darling, another of Peter's subjects, and Holly Woodlawn, and her creative output in the forms of handmade dolls, room-sized installations, and photography made her an important contributor to the art scene in Lower East Side, New York. She performed at the Pyramid Club dressed in one of her doll skins and was also featured in Nan Goldin's slideshow Ballad of Sexual Dependency. Her work was also on view relatively recently here in Los Angeles at the LA County Museum as part of Outliers in American Vanguard Art that was organized, I think, originally by the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. Fellow photographer Lynn Davis was also a regular subject for Hujar, and here I juxtapose Hujar's well-known portrait of Davis playing with her hair and Mapplethorpe's portrait of Davis pulling her hair back. Lynn Davis was also known at this time, in the early 1980s at least, for her portraiture and photographs of people. But after a trip to Greenland in 1986, she gave up photographing the human form almost entirely and shifted her attention towards sort of monumental landscapes and cultural and architectural icons, as you see in this photograph of an iceberg from Disco Bay in Greenland. And a little bit about the animal pictures, which is another sort of genre that Hujar is known for. Animal portraits had attracted Hujar from an early stage in his career, but he didn't concentrate on them until after a 1969 road trip through farm country. And only in 1976 did he begin to regularly seek out animals to photograph. When photographing animals, he spoke to them constantly and in an ordinary sort of conversational way, creating a calm, much like the mood in the studio. I think part of what's striking about his animal pictures is the illusion that they're sort of holding a pose or posing really, much as if they were people. Fran Lebowitz has a really interesting story about Hujar's sort of relationship to animals and his animal photographs. Lebowitz was in the early 1970s working at Interview magazine, which was Andy Warhol's magazine. And she tells the story of having to drive to New Jersey where the magazine was printed. And she had a driver's license, which many in her peer group didn't have. And Peter would often accompany her and would insist on stopping whenever he saw animals so he could get out and make pictures. And oftentimes he would. I don't think any of these pictures are from one of those trips. But I think I quite enjoy that little anecdote. And now to speak a little bit about perhaps the elephant in the room, and that relates to the relationship between Robert Mapplethorpe and Peter Hujar. They knew each other's work and shared many friends and several subjects and sitters. But to kind of boil it down, they didn't like each other. And there's sort of, I think, two distinct camps that a number of photographers who arrived in New York in the sort of early to mid 80s have described, and that is, you either aligned yourself with the work of Hujar or you aligned yourself with the work of Mapplethorpe. I don't know to what extent or how true that is, but I think if you were sort of part of the Lower East Side scene, perhaps there was some truth to it. Recently, another sort of anecdote that I want to relay, the art historian Abigail Solomon Godot made a comment about the role of these two photographers in New York society at the time. She was saying that Hujar largely, kept to his own and made his own type of work, but that Mapplethorpe's success kind of positioned him as a somewhat of a court photographer, and likened his aesthetic to that of Baron Adolf de Meyer. And I think while this may be somewhat, there's some cynicism in this comparison, I also think there's some truth to it and is echoed in Mapplethorpe's sort of signature or preferred aesthetic, which is not too dissimilar from that of some of Adolf de Meyer's work. According to Patricia Morris Rowe's 1995 biography of Robert Mapplethorpe, Mapplethorpe took a keen interest in the work of Hujar. whose career was sort of a shadow version of his own. Both photographed the male nude in a bare studio setting, but while Hujar's prickly personality antagonized dealers and gallery owners, Mapplethorpe played the game brilliantly. Hujar grew to sort of despise, which may be a strong word, his younger rival. But he regarded Mapplethorpe as sort of a hustler and potentially even a plagiarist. While Mapplethorpe viewed the older photographer sort of as a textbook case for how to not become famous. The two photographers were diagnosed with PCP, sort of an early onset pneumonia associated with the HIV/AIDS crisis within 2 months of each other. But while Mapplethorpe still sort of aggressively pursued his career, Hujar never really picked up his camera again. Neither would take the AZT treatment available at the time. And sort of in a typical idiosyncratic way, Hujar explored such remedies as crystal cures before converting to Catholicism. Lynn Davis, a close friend of his, tended to him until he died on Thanksgiving Day. And Mapplethorpe was among the 150 mourners who attended the Catholic funeral at St. Joseph Church in Greenwich Village. The writer Vince Leddy and David Wojnarowicz carried the photographer's remains in a simple pine coffin. And I want to end with one last slide, and that is rather devastating portrait, 3 photographs by David Wojnarowicz. And in his essay, Living Close to the Knives, Wojnarowicz wrote the following on the death of Hujar. And his death is now as if it's printed on celluloid on the back of my eyes. Hujar died from AIDS-related complications on November 26, 1987. And moments later, Wojnarowicz attempted to represent his death through various mediums. First, with a Super 8 camera, he filmed Hujar's body on his deathbed. And then he photographed individual parts of Hujar's lifeless form, including his face, his hands, and his feet. So with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions or any sort of respond to any comments. Thank you very much for being an attentive audience.
Thank you for your presentation, Arpad. That was lovely. It was very thorough and concise, and you juxtapose the relationship and material very nicely. Peter's spirit for intimacy definitely translates. Forgive me for shifting around here with my eyes. I'm just going between questions in the chat. We do have some comments here in the Q&A. This first comment is from Claire Cunny. She said not a question, but a comment, just to share a story from PAC. In 2018, PAC members visited the Morgan on our trip to New York City Hudson River Valley. Joel Smith gave us a show and tell about the formation of the Morgan's photo collection and talked about the Hujar exhibition that had just closed. Thanks for sharing that, Claire.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And something also nice to see you, Claire, or I'm glad you made it. One thing I do want to sort of recommend to all viewers is Joel Smith did an interview with Fran Lebowitz as part of that show at the Morgan that I would highly recommend everyone sort of watch. You can find it on YouTube. And in fact, that's where I got the anecdote about the animal pictures, about Peter's desire to get out of the car in New Jersey and photograph animals. But she's, she is sort of full of stories. They were, close friends and certainly part of the same kind of circle in the Lower East Side in the 1970s.
Yeah, so I don't know if you can see this here, Arpad, but you're getting some good feedback and compliments and thank yous for the presentation. Virginia Heckert said, fabulous presentation. Arpad, thank you. Rena Bayar, wonderful talk, thank you. David Muzel, the exhibit in the Morgan was superlative. Claire Cunny, yes, Arpad, such a wonderful talk, thank you. Gary Ridgewald, would it be possible, oh, this is actually a question. Gary said, would it be possible for you to share the questions? Oh, that's a question to me. Okay, Gary. Sure, I'll be able to share that following the talk. I'll export it and send it your way. David, lovely. Okay, really lovely presentation. David said, it's a really lovely presentation. Brings to life that the entire time they appeared in New York. Okay. And then Cheryl Hammer. Sorry, these are coming in quite quickly, so I just want to feed
no worries.
so not to miss any of them. They're very nice feedback and comments to you here. Cheryl Hammer, terrific presentation. Thank you. Thanks for the super presentation. Stay safe. Douglas, Sarah Hadley, fabulous presentation. When did Hujar's work gain popularity and how? So there's a question. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to repeat that back to you.
Sure.
Sarah said, fabulous presentation. And then she said, when did Hujar's work gain popularity and how?
That's a good question. I think Hujar's work, of course, was known to kind of people in the know in the sort of New York art world during the 1980s and probably well into in the 90s. But I don't think it was until about a decade or so after Hujar passed away when Matthew Mark's gallery began to work with the estate, that Hujar's sort of notoriety seeped out of New York. I mean, it's not like there were a ton of books about him. You know, I think a few people published images of his work, but he didn't, you know, publish prolifically. And so it's not like people would have known his work through sort of his books. So I really think it was that exhibition that I had mentioned in my presentation at Matthew Mark's in 2000 that really sort of opened the floodgates and really started to you know, get people's attention.
Well, thank you for that answer there, RP. We have a few more questions coming in the chat and Q&A. Margie made a comment. She said, so his friend and printer Gary Schneider is being an advocate for his work now?
Yeah, I think Gary Schneider is working with the estate to print some additional work, but I think that's a question that New Mark Selwyn could sort of better field.
Right. Question here from Michael Hawley. He said, do you know if Hujar crossed paths with /knew Cindy Sherman? We see his influence on her, but was he aware of hers, like her process and her influence?
Michael, that's an excellent question. Yeah. I don't know for sure, but I would not be surprised. You know, Cindy Sherman was showing in New York in the late 1970s, and you know, Metro Pictures, which is still her gallery, was regularly showing her work, and Peter was very much clued into the sort of art world in New York, and so I wouldn't be surprised if you know, if he knew Cindy Sherman's work. Now, in terms of whether there were any kind of, you know, whether he gained any kind of appreciation or influence of her approach, that's kind of harder to pinpoint, I think.
Thank you for that question, Michael. That was pretty interesting there. I have another one here from Evan Mirapol. He said, I know Hujar is known as a master printer. How does the museum world view prints made by him rather than by others, even other master printers?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think it depends on the institution. I think some institutions are much more rigid in their definition or in their understanding of print quality or what is desired. You know, and then it's also sort of a twofold thing. Hujar tended to print on much warmer papers, much of which is not available anymore. So a lot of the pictures that were posthumously printed tend to be a little cooler, although I think some of the prints that Gary Schneider has made try to sort of compensate for that warmth, to kind of bring that back in. I think they're pigment prints, so it's a sort of a digital compensation. but Hujar didn't, print a ton of, prints from every negative that he deemed to be sort of a final work. So of course there are sort of a limited number of prints out there.
One second here. So this is from Michael Dawson. Hi, Michael. Hujar's Da Capo press monograph has always been highly collectible. Oh, this is just a comment. Okay, sorry, I just jumped right in there. Hujar's Da Capo press monograph has always been highly collectible. I suspect the book helped to keep his images in front of the photographic community. Yes, absolutely, Michael.
Yeah, I think it's highly collectible because the print run was just so small. And I think a lot of people who bought it at the time, of course, either knew him personally or rather knew his work, and it didn't really circulate outside of a relatively speaking, a small circle until much later.
Right.
As is my understanding, at least.
Another question here. Why were Hujar's photographs of the Stonewall Uprising considered more iconic than those taken by other photographers?
I don't know. I'm not sure if his pictures are necessarily considered more iconic. That one photograph that I showed ended up as a poster. And I think that was mainly because he knew the person who was designing the poster, to be
right.
Blunt about it. And then, of course, through that, that picture, that specific picture gained a level of notoriety that maybe, it wouldn't have otherwise.
Okay, so we're closing in here. I think we've covered a lot of the Q&A. Everyone send in your last questions if you have any in the chat or Q&A, but I have one, or rather a request, if you could. I was very curious with your juxtapositions. I think that the images that you chose compared to his influencers were quite concise and wonderful. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your process in that. What influencers you were drawn to, and how you made that decision, right? I saw a lot of sculptural work, which I actually love to see the crossover between the materiality. So if you can kind of give a little bit of an insight to that process.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure if I can give a satisfying answer. I think I think it's just how my brain works. But I also think that Peter Hujar was just incredibly well connected in the art scene in New York at like this very specific moment, and I wanted to. So he was very connected in this specific moment. So I wanted to offer some other images of work made by artists that were friends or lovers. But he was also very educated on sort of the history of the medium, the sort of burgeoning history of the medium. The history of photography was quite young at that stage in the 1970s. And so it's not like he was, reaching for a big history textbook, photo history textbook. Right. But he went to galleries regularly, right? And so sort of had conversations, and he became knowledgeable about people like Berenice Abbott and Lisette Model, often through direct interactions with people who knew them directly or knew their work intimately. He didn't know Diane Arbus very well, but they did cross paths, for example. He knew Avedon, for example, and Avedon, became a patron of Hujar in the 1980s. Bought his work and became a sort of a real sort of admirer of his work. So, I mean, he has this reputation, I think, of being rather difficult or cantankerous, but I don't know if that's always borne out, because he did manage to have this really great, kind of interconnected system of fellow artists, and he was clued into what others were doing, and his work, of course, he didn't achieve the level of sort of fame and notoriety as Mapplethorpe, far from it, but he definitely had his sort of ear to the ground, and people knew him and knew his work.
Okay, thank you. That was a satisfying answer. It might have been a weird question to ask, but you answered
No,
it.
not at all, not at all.
Just a few more comments here. I'm going to go ahead and read Ali Amali's comment. She said, totally agree with Margie as far as the comparison and the contrast to Mapplethorpe. She said it was great to hear and consider. I feel like Mapplethorpe maybe wasn't the only elephant in the room. Okay, but the room. Okay, sorry, Ollie, if I kind of butchered that there. I didn't understand. I think you said, yeah, Mapplethorpe wasn't the only elephant in the room. Yeah, but the room. Okay. And then Douglas said, can you run through the pairings of the images quickly?
Oh, let me see if I can. Well, there's one pairing, which is just my own sort of free association.
Right.
The Abaddon and Hujar pairing is not really, it's not a comparison. Of course, Abaddon had a very different aesthetic, a very specific aesthetic when it came to his commercial work than what Hujar did. And in fact, one of the pictures that I was thinking of juxtaposing with this Hujar picture is a street photograph by Harry Callahan, where Callahan was taking photographs kind of surreptitiously in the street, and it has a very kind of similar aesthetic to this picture by Hujar. That's not really, but then another juxtaposition or another sort of comparison is, of course, with Diane Arbus, and this both in terms of form, but also content. Form, both of them focusing rather on a single sitter, and both of the sitters happen to be men performing in drag. And then the Ethel Eichelberger with the Nan Goldin picture. I love this Nan Goldin picture quite a bit. It's in the Getty's collection. This comparison between Abbott and Hujar, and really this is just about perspective. It's just about, they're both on the street looking up and then turning their camera, to the sky, and being sort of overwhelmed by the height of these buildings surrounding them. Trying to think, where are the other juxtapositions? Oh yeah, this is another kind of juxtaposition that maybe takes a bit of imagination to really see, but to me it makes sense, this idea of the pepper, the sort of the folds in the pepper kind of mimicking the contortion of the sitter.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know. Am I rambling? Am I going?
You're not rambling. You're not rambling. You jumped on that quite quickly. I have actually another question here from Lynn Robb. And we'll be closing up shortly. But if you guys would sit tight, and Arpad, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Arpad, excellent overview of Hujar's work and life. Thank you. Can you comment on how the combined persona of Hujar's aesthetic and his personality differed from Mapplethorpe's aesthetic and personality in terms of the trajectory of each artist's success during their lifetime?
That's a big question. I mean, as I mentioned, I think Hujar often was seen as someone who was a little difficult and particular, and his pictures, I don't think they necessarily reflect that reputation, but his pictures certainly have an introspective quality, a sort of cerebral quality that don't necessarily always, they don't appeal to a wide kind of swath of people. I think Mapplethorpe, on the other hand, was quite sort of gregarious and sort of outgoing, and was willing to kind of be malleable in his sort of approach. But he also had this kind of signature, he developed rather a signature aesthetic into the 1980s that is often described as slick, as kind of commercial, as he sort of had his lighting set up in a studio, and he would just sort of sit her down and gave them sort of the same direction over and over. Whereas I think Hujar really kind of waited for the sitter to provide their own direction, or provide, their own kind of inspiration. And that's a lot of times where Hujar's pictures come from. Whereas I think Mapplethorpe, certainly by the mid to late 80s, his photographs, were being created, as in a kind of a more of a formulaic way. I know this is sort of maybe an unpopular opinion. There are diehard sort of Mapplethorpe fans, and I don't mean to sort of offend, but I think there's a lot of difference in the sensibilities that these two photographers brought to their picture making, and I think that those are sort of borne out in the pictures.
Yeah. And Michael Hawley here gave a good comment that everyone's agreeing was a great comment. He said, plus, Hujar didn't have a rich patron like Mapplethorpe to promote his work. Mapplethorpe had Wagstaff.
Yes, I was trying to, talk around that, but that's I shouldn't. I mean, there's also a lot to be said about Wagstaff's role as a mover and shaker, right? As someone who kind of made things happen for Mapplethorpe, right? And Hujar surrounded himself with writers and performers and other artists who is it that now publishes every year the most powerful people in art, some publication, and artists are never on top of that list.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, Michael, thank you for that comment. You're absolutely right. Wagstaff played an instrumental role in Mapplethorpe's success.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to close it there. Arpy, do you have any last or final statements that you'd like to make regarding this before we say goodbye?
No, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to tune in. And like I said, if you have a chance to go and see the show, I highly recommend it. I kind of strayed from the checklist of the objects that are in the show at Marks in order to include, things like this image of Paul Tech and the catacombs. But the show is filled with really beautiful prints and really sort of signature images, much like this portrait of Susan Sontag, which I think a lot of people are aware of and know and may not know that it's by Peter Hujar.
Yeah. And again, I added the link at the top of the chat early on to the exhibition. So visit the website and you can probably book an appointment to view. Again, it closes tomorrow. It was extended and closed tomorrow. So we're fortunate to have Arpy here on the final days. And again, thank you, Arpy, for being here with us and taking the time to speak with us. And thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.